A coincidence is defined as a series of events and circumstances which seemingly have no apparent connection to each other, but wind up being related by pure chance. Whenever a mysterious crime takes place, investigators will attempt to solve it by piecing together the events and circumstances surrounding the case. However, complications can ensue when a coincidence enters the picture. An investigation can be seriously hampered when one is forced to look into events which, at first glance, appear to be connected to the crime but turn out to be nothing more than a bizarre coincidence. In many of these cases, the coincidence had no direct connection to the crime but made for an interesting story within a story. 10. The deaths of Iqbal Al-Hilli and her secret ex-husband. On September 5, 2012, a shocking mass murder took place near Xlife, France. A British tourist named Saad Al-Hilli was traveling on a mountainside road with his wife, Iqbal, their two young daughters, Zainab and Zina, and Iqbal's elderly mother, Suhaila Al-Hilli. Sometime that afternoon, their vehicle was ambushed near Lake Ensue and riddled with bullets. Saad, Iqbal, and Suhaila were all shot to death. Zina survived the attack by staying hidden, and Zainab was wounded but managed to pull through. A French cyclist named Sylvain Mollier was also found dead at the scene, presumably at the wrong place at the wrong time. To this day, investigators have been unable to determine who was responsible, or what their motive might have been, and the shooting has been described as the perfect crime. If that wasn't enough, the murders were also followed by an astonishing coincidence. None of Iqbal's family or friends knew this wasn't her first marriage. In February 1999, Iqbal was working in the US and, in order to get a green card and remain in the country, she agreed to marry an oil worker named Jim Thompson. The marriage did not work out, and the couple split up the following year. When Iqbal left the country, she eventually got remarried and started a family with Saad Al-Hilli, but never told anybody about her previous marriage to Thompson. However, the marriage ceased to be a secret after a stunning turn of events. Mere hours after Iqbal Al-Hilli's murder, Jim Thompson suffered a fatal heart attack while driving through his hometown of Natchez, Mississippi. Naturally, there was some suspicion of foul play, but it appears that Thompson's death had no connection to his ex-wife and was nothing more than an unfortunate coincidence. 9. The disappearances of Stacy Peterson and her mother. One of the most sensational crime stories of recent years was the disappearance of 23-year-old Stacy Peterson. In 2007, Stacy lived in Bolingbrook, Illinois with her police officer husband, Drew Peterson, who was 30 years older and on his fourth marriage. On October 28, Stacy went missing, and since her marriage to Drew was troubled at the time, suspicion immediately turned to him. 3 years earlier, Drew's third wife, Kathleen Savio, was found dead in her bathtub in what was initially believed to be an accidental drowning. Drew collected a substantial life insurance policy, but Stacy's disappearance prompted another investigation into Kathleen's death. In 2009, Drew was charged with his ex-wife's murder and eventually sentenced to 38 years in prison. He remains the prime suspect in Stacy's disappearance, but her body has never been found. Stacy's disappearance was just the latest in a long line of tragedies for her family. In an eerie confidence, Stacy's 40-year-old mother, Christy Cales, had also vanished under suspicious circumstances 9 years earlier. Christy had a total of 6 children but lost 2 of them during the 1980s when they were infants. Christy abused drugs and alcohol, was often in trouble with the law, and had a turbulent relationship with her husband. The couple often neglected their children, but when they divorced in 1990, Christy's husband got sole custody. In 1998, Christy was living with her boyfriend in Blue Island, Illinois. On March 11, she apparently walked out of her home and never returned, and that was the last anyone ever saw of her. Much like with Stacy, Christy's family has always suspected that her spouse was responsible for her disappearance, but there wasn't enough evidence to charge him. Officially, both Christy Cales and her daughter remain missing. 8. The murder victim who succumbed to a rare blood disease. In 1964, 33-year-old Calvin Jones was involved in a relationship with 23-year-old Sarah Tolbert. On June 13, The Philadelphia couple got into a heated argument inside Jones's vehicle and he responded by viciously beating his girlfriend with a rubber hose 15 times. Jones then spent the next several hours driving around with Tolbert's body inside his car and, at some unspecified point, she died. Jones finally decided to drive to a police station and confess to murder. He had previously spent time in prison for trying to poison his wife, so it seemed like his punishment would be severe. However, Jones would not face a murder charge when he went to court, as a remarkable set of circumstances would allow him to plead guilty to the lesser charge of aggravated assault and battery. In a stunning coincidence, it turned out that even if she was not beaten by her boyfriend, Sarah Tolbert still would have died the following morning. After a medical examination was done on Tolbert's body, it was discovered that she was suffering from a very rare blood disease called sickle cell anemia. At the time Jones assaulted her, Tolbert only had hours to live before the disease became fatal. 2 different medical examiners officially concluded that Tolbert died of natural causes, so it was impossible to prove that Jones's beating played any role in her death. In the end, the judge agreed to accept Jones's guilty plea to assault and battery but stated that the defendant would have been indicted for murder were it not for the unlikely coincidence. 7. The wrongful conviction of Dennis Marr. On the evening of November 16, 1983, a woman walking through Lowell, Massachusetts was attacked by a male assailant and raped. The following night, another woman was attacked by a man in the exact same area, but she managed to escape and provide a description to police. Later that evening, a resident named Dennis Marr was detained, and both victims positively identified him as their attacker. Marr would be charged with the attacks and, after an unsolved rape from the previous summer was also pinned on him, he was sentenced to life in prison. Years later, he got in touch with the Innocence Project, an organization dedicated to helping wrongfully convicted people. They successfully lobbied for DNA testing on the evidence, and it excluded Marr as the perpetrator of the rapes. In 2003, he was released after serving 19 years in prison for crimes he didn't commit. Unfortunately for Marr, he had been railroaded because of an unbelievable series of coincidences. The second victim told police that her attacker wore a red hooded sweatshirt and military-style jacket and had threatened her with a knife. Later that night, while exiting a liquor store, Marr garnered a cop's attention because he was wearing a red hooded sweatshirt. A military jacket and a knife were later found in Marr's vehicle. Given the circumstances, it seemed perfectly logical to believe Marr was the attacker, especially after the victims identified him. However, at the time, Marr was a sergeant in the United States Army, so it wasn't unusual for him to have a military jacket and military knife in his vehicle. After DNA testing exonerated Marr, it became apparent the victims who identified him were mistaken, and that he was just a tragic victim of bad luck. The real perpetrator was never found. 6. The Mary Morris murders. On the morning of October 12, 2000, 48-year-old Mary Henderson Morris left her Houston home. Later that day, her burned car was found in a remote area with Mary's torched body inside. Curiously, the victim's wedding ring was missing. By all accounts, Mary was a loving wife and mother without any enemies, so no one could figure out why she was murdered in such a horrific fashion. However, the case took a surprising turn 3 days later when a 39-year-old woman was found dead inside her car in the same vicinity. She had been beaten and shot with her own gun in a failed attempt to make her death look like suicide. The victim's name, Mary McGinnis Morris. Shortly before her death, Mary McGinnis Morris had made a frantic phone call to 911 while she was being attacked. Attention soon turned toward Mary's husband, Mike Morris, who stood to collect a substantial life insurance policy from his wife's death. While Mike had an alibi during the time of Mary's murder, phone records showed that he made a 4-minute call to Mary's cell phone 2 hours after her frantic call to 911. Mike claimed that no one answered the call, and that he let Mary's phone ring for 4 straight minutes. This led to a theory that Mike hired someone to murder his wife but that they killed another person named Mary Morris by mistake. Mary Henderson Morris's missing wedding ring may have been taken by a contract killer as proof that they completed the job. However, Police have since leaned toward the position that the two Mary Morris murders are nothing more than a bizarre coincidence and have no connection to each other. Nevertheless, they both remain unsolved. 5. The disappearances of the Palmer brothers. In missing person cases, it's not uncommon for siblings or family members to disappear together. However, it's extremely rare for two siblings to go missing at different times under completely different circumstances. In 1999, 15-year-old Michael Palmer lived in Wasilla, Alaska and was the youngest of three brothers. During the early morning hours of June 4th, Michael and three friends left a graduation party on their bicycles, but Michael got so far behind that they lost sight of him. When Michael never returned home, he was reported missing. Michael's bicycle was later discovered in the Little Susitna River, and his wet, muddy sneakers were found 180 meters, 600 feet, away. A search of the river turned up no trace of Michael's body, and he has never been found. Believe it or not, Michael's older brother, Chucky, would also disappear under mysterious circumstances over a decade later. On April 13, 2010, 30-year-old Chucky was staying with friends and relatives at a cabin in the Talkeetna Mountains. That night, they decided to take a ride through the area on their snowmobiles. However, much like his younger brother, Chucky became separated from his group at some point and was never seen again. His snowmobile was found the following day, but there was no sign of Chucky or any footprints in the area. Chris Palmer, the oldest sibling in the family, had stayed behind at the cabin the night Chucky disappeared. He now had to go through the ordeal of searching for a missing younger brother, for the second time in 11 years, and coming up empty. 4. Couple reports murder before being charged with unrelated murder. Shortly after midnight on July 3, 1991, 21-year-old Kirsten Davis was finishing up a trip from her hometown of Boulder, Colorado to visit a friend in Vidalia, Georgia. Davis was approximately 8 kilometers, 5 miles, away from her destination when another vehicle pulled up alongside her station wagon. Someone from the vehicle pulled out a shotgun and fired it at Davis's head. She was killed instantly, and her car overturned on the side of the road. Shortly after, a young married couple named Tracy and Karen Wilkes happened upon Davis's overturned car and reported her murder to the police. In a strange coincidence, the couple would soon find themselves embroiled in another murder in the area, which they themselves committed. About 45 days after the Davis murder, Tracy and Karen Wilkes burglarized and burned down the Treatland County home of 69-year-old Earl V. Hudson, shooting him 3 times in the head. The couple attempted to flee the area and escape to Alabama. When Tracy decided to return home to retrieve some items, he was subsequently arrested. Shortly thereafter, Karen was found living in a trailer in Alabama and had the murder weapon in her possession. On August 23, they were both formally charged with murder, burglary, and arson. Naturally, authorities started to suspect that the couple who found Kirsten Davis's body were actually responsible for her murder. However, they both passed polygraph tests, and there is no evidence they committed the crime. Tracy and Karen pleaded guilty to the Hudson murder and went to prison, but Kirsten Davis's senseless, and seemingly random, murder is still unsolved. 3. The Lucia de Burke trial. One of the most sensational murder cases in the history of the Netherlands was the trial of Lucia de Burke, where the very concept of coincidence was introduced as evidence. De Burke worked as a pediatric nurse at 3 different hospitals in The Hague. On September 4, 2001, de Burke was present when an infant girl died at the Juliana Children's Hospital. Her co-workers soon expressed concern after noticing a pattern. De Burke just happened to be on duty during a large number of deaths and resuscitations at the hospital, most of them involving infants. After an investigation, the hospital concluded that these deaths were unnatural and decided to press charges against de Burke. On March 24, 2003, she was sentenced to life imprisonment on 4 counts of murder and 3 counts of attempted murder. Since there was no physical evidence against de Burke, or any witnesses to her crimes, statistics were used as the linchpin of the prosecution's case. They claimed that de Burke's presence in the hospital when all these deaths took place could not be coincidental. An expert testified that the odds of it being a coincidence were 1 in 342 million. However, de Burke had numerous supporters who believed she was the victim of a miscarriage of justice, and appealed her conviction. They sought to debunk the statistics from the Burke's trial, which had been presented by an unqualified law professor. A professor of mathematical statistics argued that the odds of all these deaths being a coincidence were 1 in 48. The case was heard in front of the Supreme Court of the Netherlands, which agreed that the statistical evidence was flawed and granted a new trial. A new investigation concluded that de Burke's alleged murders were likely natural deaths. In April 2010, she received a not guilty verdict and was exonerated. 2. The Liquid Matthew case. On December 6, 1983, an unidentified Hispanic man was found strangled to death in a vacant lot in Hialeah, Florida. For a brief period, this baffling murder became known as the Liquid Matthew case because of a series of bizarre notes discovered at the scene. A plastic bag was found taped behind a nearby no dumping sign containing a note with some strange poetry. It read, "Now the motive is clear and the victim is too. You've got all the answers. Just follow the clues." The poetry also contained a riddle which led police to the next clue. Another poem was taped behind a speed limit sign. This poem contained the cryptic verses, "Yes, Matthew is dead, but his body not felt. Those brains were not mapped because his body did melt. For Billy threw Matthew in some hot boiling oil. To confuse the police for the mystery they did toil." However, there soon turned out to be an innocent explanation for this confusing mystery. On Halloween, 4 local churches had organized an elaborate murder mystery game where the participants concocted fictitious crimes and hid cryptic clues throughout the area. The strange poetry was all part of this murder mystery game. Since it wound up raining on the night the game took place, the notes were never retrieved and remained there for over a month. In a macabre coincidence, a real murder victim was found in the exact same area, but his death ultimately had no connection to the cryptic poetry whatsoever. In the end, the victim was identified as a Colombian seaman named Francisco Patino Gutierrez, and his murder was believed to be related to drug smuggling. 1. The Trunk Murders. During one 7-year period, the town of Brighton, England had 2 unrelated murders in which female victims were dismembered and found inside trunks. There were also 2 similar murders nearby. In 1927, a trunk containing the body of a dismembered woman named Minnie Boniati was found at Charing Cross Station in London. Her killer, John Robinson, was soon charged with the murder and hanged. 7 years later, 2 trunk murders took place within 1 month of each other. On June 17, 1934, an unclaimed trunk was discovered at Brighton railway station containing the dismembered torso of a young woman. Her head, arms, and legs were missing, but 1 day later, a suitcase containing the legs was found at another railway station. The victim was 5 months pregnant, but there was no indication about who she was. To this day, the identity of the woman and her killer remains unknown. In an attempt to solve the murder, police started searching through residences in the area. Incredibly, they would find a trunk containing another dismembered woman. The decomposing victim was identified as a 42-year-old prostitute named Viola K., who had been missing since May. When Kay disappeared, her boyfriend Tony Mancini told everyone she left for Paris. The trunk containing Kay's body was found inside Mancini's flat, and he was arrested and charged with her murder. At trial, Mancini's defense team argued that Kay had been killed by someone else. When Mancini found her, he was worried about being accused of the murder, so he decided to dismember her body and hide it inside a trunk. Believe it or not, the jury bought Mancini's story and acquitted him. In 1976, Mancini finally confessed to Kay's murder, but he could not be tried for the crime again. In spite of their similarities, the 2 Brighton trunk murders were determined to be unrelated.